Doctoral
What year? What semester?
in four.
Fourth semester. So almost proposal.
Oh, my God.
So already proposed.
Doing.
Okay. Yeah, so
Hello.
I'm Sabrina Sari. I'm from Doctoral students for the first semester in Taiwan. Actually, I still have proposal, but it's still in waiting for the.
Okay. Very good.
And one of our new
PhD.
so everybody introduce your new friend
Oh.
at the local program.
I'm Hani Sustilawati Muhammad.
Honey.
Hani. Suka. I just attend about second week.
Yes, second week.
Second week, fresh. Wow. Fresh. What university you're from?
Gajah Mada University.
Oh, again,
Yeah.
from Jogja.
Yes.
Okay, so same hometown. Good. Good.
For the next, I think, if you have certain questions, like and you have to say something, your face like saying something. Say something. Let me check it live.
We have a good class yesterday.
Good rest.
Yesterday. This was only yesterday. We have a break after having this long session with us.
Wonderful rest after hearing your research. It's good. It's more like you, it's good to practice for you to explain your own research, even in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
Because when you meet people, they ask, okay, what are you working on? It was good. I enjoyed, you, and I was telling I met with the people from the legal office that I see in charge of the research, and I told them, when I meet with you guys were, I can tell that you care about the research about it, you're passionate about it, but you just want to do the best you can to accomplish as best you can. So it's good for you, good for the university. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I have already formatted this USB, so I thought this is really safe from.
Well, actually, I'll start a cleaner version.
Yeah.
You need and you this
Okay.
work.
Our seniors said that this is the first time, the first time, we really actually invite many professors to mentor us. So they're kind of jealous.
Yeah, so I've been coming from 2008. This is my first time doing the one-on-one mentoring. I thought it would be nice if we fun and effective and hopefully, this is valuable. So I wanted to try this time, so it's more about getting to know your individual. Good? Yes. Not yet?
Okay.
Oh, I didn't do the yes. Okay, I'll send it to you forward. Maybe I work, you want me to work in
Probably with them getting I think from.
Maybe.
but I did not get like the error message. So I thought it just sent.
Oh, okay.
I'll resend it to the community.
Yeah.
I consider it words. It's not going to take the full for that problem. Or you say people the next 5 minutes, 7 minutes.
Yeah. I see it. All the time, I see it. So it's
Offline, okay, there's only 6.
6 will be the including us.
I could do another 5 minutes. 5 to 10
5 minutes?
minutes. Yeah.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah. No, I can do it. I said it where I can. Plus, if I go, sometimes go too fast. Yes, please. You did that.
Well,
That's fine. You know, you're. That's
I think that's. You can just. Not even go to this.
that real time.
I don't know what's going on with the 2 clocks and the like 2 classrooms.
Hello. You like.
So I will ask you.
Yeah, that'd be great, because I know she. works.
Yeah. Me too. You have always have a good morning. Let's start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. And now we have the black box for you, not too heavy. So I don't think I need to introduce Pak Adi Masli to all of you, but we have some new people. So thank you for coming to the academic talk for those of you who are new in the program. So we have this kind of activities continuously throughout the year, and I really hope that you will take advantage of this kind of activity to get to know your friends. So, for the medical students, the great PhD students we have in the program will be a really good source of you to get a lot of information, insight about research. And of course, I would love to have you all get to know each other. And today we have our esteemed guest, Pak Adi Masli. He's from KU, University of Kansas. Adi got his PhD from University of Arkansas, but I think Pak Adi will explain more about himself throughout the presentation. That basically Pak Adi is one of a very productive researcher in accounting. So if you Google his name, you will see a lot of his papers published at a really high ranked accounting journal. So absolutely we have a lot to learn from him, and he's going to talk about relating to the research paper, which is how you design a research paper, how you craft a research paper, and some strategy in publishing your work, which is something that's really important for all of you who've been working on research, and then the next step will be to publish your research. So I will not take too much time anymore, and I'll just give the floor to Pak Adi. Again, thank you so much for coming and for joining us for all this year. So this is probably the 5th year.
Yeah.
Right? So Pak Adi came the first time when I was the first time I came back from the PhD program. So it's been with all of us for all this year. So thank you, Pak Adi, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louise. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Buli, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to visit Buli and to see the faces of Indonesia's future researchers. Right? It's all on you to advance our country's research forward. So as Buli mentioned, I think my talk today is I want to give something that can be applied right away. We are all researchers in the room. And the idea is, okay, how can we, if we look at a research paper as a product, what are the best practices? What are things we should avoid? What are things that we should highlight? Because eventually our goal, everyone here, is to publish at the best place possible, right? So before that, so as Buli mentioned, I'm originally from, I graduated from University of Arkansas. Let me tell you a little story about my background. In 2005, I graduated from the undergraduate program in accounting and information systems as an undergrad. After graduating from the undergraduate program, I went into the master's program in 2006, and then I graduated from the PhD program in 2011. So I never left the university. I spent 10 years, a whole decade, or 11 years actually, as a student. I probably will not do that again in my next lifetime. So that was my path. My background is my father is a professor, accounting professor. So I kind of knew I wanted to do this from the beginning, right? So I did not, in my mind, I did not take the opportunity to work outside of academia and went straight. Again, I probably won't do it again, but once you're a student, you're already poor. You can be poor for another 5 years, right? PhD program. So after graduating from the PhD program, I got recruited into the University of Kansas as an assistant professor in 2011. And then in 2016, I was promoted to associate professor, and then recently or last year to full professor. So I've been at the same university since then. So I've only known 2 universities in my life, University of Arkansas and KU, and now UI, because I come here every year, it's almost, so it feels kind of like home. Okay, so that's just a bit of background. In terms of service work that I've been doing, just until last year, I was the president of the American Accounting Association Accounting Information System section. So if you know, the AAA has many different sections, like financial reporting is the biggest, auditing, taxation. So for AIS, Accounting Information System, I served as its president for 1 year until last year. Right, so if anybody here is interested in joining the AI section, come talk to me. And also, I've been serving on editorial boards. I'm now currently on the editorial board for the Accounting Review, AAA Journal, and Auditing, Journal Practice in Theory. So both of these are AAA journals, and also for Jackie, serving editorial boards. So let me just take a minute, because my department chair would be upset if I don't do this. Let me advertise a little bit about KU and what I think is a really very good faculty that we have at University of Kansas. So this is according to the BYU Accounting Research Ranking, which is a ranking system that ranks university and individual researchers of their accounting research productivity in the whole world. Right? So our department, is ranked number 18 when we look at any type of accounting research. But if we look at archival, we're ranked number 12, and we specialize actually in auditing research. So for auditing research, we're ranked number 2 in the world. And our mission at our university or in our department, in our faculty, is to do better than this. Hopefully we can improve. Okay, a little bit about my research interests. My first research interest is on financial reporting and auditing. So for auditing, I'm interested in both internal and external auditing. IT, information technology and business organization. I'm very interested in looking at how IT investments affect business value, or how IT investments affect the quality of financial reports. Right. The next research interest I have is on top management teams and executive leadership, specifically in the C-suite. Also top executives that are not in the C-suite, board of directors, their traits, their characteristics, their knowledge, their expertise. And my last box is on ESG and sustainability, which I know many of you here are also interested in that. We had some good discussion about that. So I'm interested in these things, but what really gets me excited is looking at the intersection between some of these things. So if you look at the stuff I've been doing, it's not necessarily in one box only. I like to look at multi or cross-disciplinary or cross-research interests, right? Okay, so here's the thing. In my career, I've had over 40 publications, as Buyuli mentioned, but there's a big but. I've also had more than 100 rejections from various journals. Because you see, almost every paper I published were once rejected at somewhere else. Very rarely is my first submission a publication right away, maybe only 4 or 5. Okay. So this is the thing, right? We're in a profession where rejection is kind of the norm, right? So what I'm going to talk to you about today is more not from the things I've learned from being published, is what I've learned from being rejected, right? Because I've learned and I'm continuing to learn, right? I don't proclaim to know every answer or everything, but from these failures, that's where and not only from my failures, from the failures of people I know, my colleagues at KU, my PhD students, my co-authors on their other work. Over time, I've accumulated knowledge about, okay, this seems to things that help us get published. These are things that help us get rejected, right? So the way I look at things is my publishing publishing or publishing strategy. In my mind, I see this bookshelf where there's 4 shelves. You have the top shelf, the second shelf, the third shelf, and the fourth shelf. In my mind, okay, we have 6 journals in the top shelf. Okay, so we have, these are the top 6 accounting journals, or top journals in accounting, which you know, Accounting Review, JAE, JAR, CAR, AOS, Review Accounting. Why is it in the top 6? Because, well, KU tells me that's the top 6, right? Because they have certain standards that we have to kind of meet, right? So we have the top 6, and then below this, in what I call the second shelf journals, these are all very good journals, but they're outside of the top 6. Things like AJPT, Accounting Horizons, Journal of Information Systems, etc. Right? So on this second shelf, there's a lot of journals. And then there's journals in the third shelf, and what I would call in the bottom, minor publication. So when I go into a paper, ideally, when I write a paper, my intention is to publish in the top shelf, right? But understanding this profession is very rare, like I mentioned, that you get what you wish for the first time. So if you strike out in the top shelf, well, then you go, there's a second shelf. The second shelf, there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of journals, right? That, with different objectives and things like that. You strike out there, you go to the third shelf, and so on, by publication. But I think it's important, as we do research and we believe in what we're doing, and we believe that our study is making a contribution, at least we have every intention of trying to go to the best possible. Now, I'm not saying that everything you publish has to be in the top shelf. That's not in this world, right? It's not realistic. Sometimes I have papers that are smaller in nature, very limited contribution. I go straight to third shelf or minor publication. That's okay, because our research is a portfolio. Not everything in your portfolio wins. Like when you own stocks, stock portfolio, some have positive, some have negative returns, right? So, but we at least have the intention of, giving our work the best shot it deserves, right? Okay. So this is my personal. Then you can go to the Australian Business Dean Council. This is probably the list that almost most universities, at least in the US, use, where they go from A+, A, B, C, and etc. The good news for us, for you young researchers especially, is that compared to several decades ago, there are now more peer-reviewed journals that you can choose from. Good journals, good peer-reviewed journals, right? So there are more opportunities. So again, the idea is, as we get into how do we minimize this rejection, right? A little bit about why I love research, and this is most of the time, not all the time, right? And maybe you can identify with these reasons. I think it's important before we get into the specifics about why are we doing this, right? Why are you here in this classroom, or why are you pursuing your degree? Nobody's forcing you to do this, correct? And also, this is something you'll do for the rest of your life, correct? Right? So, the excitement of discovery, right? Do you get excited when you discover something? Maybe it's the first time you discover something new that you can share with everybody else, right? It's the excitement of discovery, right? Especially if you discover something that really matters. Fulfilling our curiosity, I believe as researchers or academics, we're inherently curious. And sometimes if we really want to know the answer to something, a research question or objective, we work harder to identify that. Freedom to pursue your own interests. Nobody here is being forced to research what you're researching, right? I hope not. Maybe your professor or promoter is guiding you to a certain. That's fine. That's accepted. But nobody's pressuring you. So you will spend the rest of your life researching whatever you want to research, whatever interests you, whatever you're curious about, right? And in this, you get to work with and learn from others. So I've had over 70 different co-authors in throughout this time. So out of these co-authors, I've worked and learned. I may not like every single one of them, right? Because it's hit or miss, right? You don't like, but you learn from them, you're inspired by them. And it's just nice to work in teams, right? I'm working with Buyuli on a research project, right? And I'm learning from her as we speak, right? On her strengths and what she knows. Right? And the writing process, I don't know, I like writing more than reading. So a research paper gets me, I just like to actually put ideas on paper and at least having the thought that somebody's reading what I'm writing. Why I don't love research sometimes, right? Why I don't love research, or dare I say why I hate research sometimes. The peer review process is not perfect. When you submit your paper, you're not submitting to an AI machine or an objective process. You're submitting it to human beings that have subjective reasons and biases. So the peer review process is not perfect, but that's what we have, right? The fear of uncertainty, right? Like I have this all the time, like I'm gonna invest 2 years of my life in this project, for example, but there's no certainty whether it's going to get published, correct? But it's okay, we all have this uncertainty, right? It's not specific to you. Can take a long time. In the natural science, the average publication from submission to publication is about 6 months. In accounting or business, it's about 2 years. And that's if the journal gives you a revise and resubmit. If we keep rejection, it can take longer. And this one, often have targets that create heavy pressure. So like at KU, when I came into KU, or University of Kansas, they say, okay, you have 5 years to publish in the top 6 that I mentioned. Outside the top 6, we won't count it. And if I don't, then I would have to leave and find a different job. So we all face this, don't we? Like as students, you have a target, right? You have to publish to graduate, right? Okay, so I'm not necessarily saying anything you don't know, but at least you can see you're not alone, right? You have these thoughts. But I think it's important to balance and remember the good and the bad, the positive and the negative. So in this research process, publication, there's a lot of things we cannot control, but you cannot control who edits your paper. If you send me your paper to me as an editor, I will send it to reviewers. You have no control over the reviewers I pick, right? And what if you send it to a reviewer and the reviewer is going to read your paper for the first time and he just got into a fight with his wife? He's in a bad mood. Do you think he's going to like your paper no matter what? Right? You can't control that, right? But what I want to focus on is there are things we can control. And that's what I want to talk about today. We can control the quality of our work. We can control how careful we are in doing the analysis. We can even control the timeliness of our research. Okay, so let's start with this also. So if we think about, okay, we're submitting a paper, what factors really matter to the editor and reviewer? So I want to give this to you, okay, from the other side, from the review team that is reviewing your paper. And again, I've learned this through many, many rejections, okay? So the reviewer and the editor is asking, well, is the paper making an important contribution to the literature? Right? That's the first question that they ask, right? And don't worry about taking notes. I will send this to you, so you don't have to write every single thing down. So is the paper making an important contribution to the literature, right? That's the number one, that's probably the number one thing the editor is asking. Is it interesting to a broad readership of the journal? So editors don't like it when the topic you're investigating is too narrow. Because think about the editor. The editor wants the journal to be read by as many people as possible. So be careful about having topics
they're too narrow in scope that would only matter to a certain cluster of people? Is it impact for actual stakeholders of business, right? Your work, who does it really inform? Does it really matter to investors, auditors, analysts, managers, dewan komisaris, banks, lenders? There's many different stakeholders of business, right? Is it impactful? Presenting in a scope, we'll talk about this. Scope is basically size of the paper or how much you do in the paper. So that's also important. Is it making solid and logical theoretical arguments? So here, it doesn't really matter if you show me a table with perfect p-values, 0 p-values, all stars, everything is significant. Even if your results are super, super strong, it really doesn't matter if you don't present this, if there's no solid logical or theoretical arguments underlying those reasons. And that's one of the common mistakes, is we are so confident in our results that we forget to, tell a good story or tell why. Is it advancing the journal's objectives? So you may find that some of these journals may have specific objectives and mission. Does it meet that specific objective? Is it executed correctly, competently? Is it written well and clearly? So this is it. Like, if you can, these are the most common things that editors and reviewers are looking for, right? So I know it's a long list, but even if we meet, 2 or 3 or 4 of these, it gives us a better chance. So the number one killer of paper submissions is insufficient contribution to prior literature. Over and over and over again, not enough contribution to prior literature is the number one rejection killer, right? So I want to show you some examples of reviews that I've gotten. So this is real reviews that I've received. So they say, unfortunately, both reviewers recommend, et cetera, the review report should be of help to you in understanding. I share with the first reviewer's concern that the contribution of the paper is narrow, right? So this is from the editor letter that I received from Contemporary Accounting Research. Another journal, they say, unfortunately, et cetera, but at the end, both reviewers raised similar concerns about the incremental contribution of the paper, right? So, like it or not, this is the number one thing that will get you rejected, especially in the top journal, right? So they may say, in fact, in this one said, oh, we have no problem with how you executed your research. We have no problem with your design. We have no problem with the data, but the contribution. Now, here's the thing. What is enough contribution? If this is the number one killer, but unfortunately, it is a very subjective opinion. Right? Like, I cannot show you the p-value for my contribution. All right, I cannot show you what's the R squared or adjusted R squared for my contribution, can I? It's not quantitative. And because of that, it's very easy for reviewers to complain about the lack of contribution, because reviewers, when they say this, guess what? They do not have to provide any evidence, right? And usually this is the first line they say. They say, my major concern is that the study lacks contribution, and then they move to the second. They don't have to provide proof. And unfortunately, this is something that we have to battle specifically in the business research discipline, because if you go to natural science like biology or physics, they specifically ask reviewers not to judge a paper by contribution. They say that the market will decide. They just want to know, is the study done correctly? See? But in business, unfortunately right now, and maybe this will change, when you all become senior professors, you can change this. But right now, it's not the case. But at the same time, and this is what I wanted to come across, is sometimes it's natural for us as the author to overestimate the contribution of our work, because we like our work. Right? We'd be crazy not to, right? We invested a lot of time, so it's natural for us. So my message, and I'll show you a little bit later on, is what can we do? Well, what we can do is we first have to recognize this, and we have to be honest with ourselves. You know, our contribution, which journal does this match, right? And secondly, the most important thing is we have to be proactive and sell to the review team or the reader our contribution. Okay. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So in terms of contribution, something to just keep remember, we do business research, so our work should matter to business stakeholder, does it not? So that's a good starting point. It's like, what are you doing in your dissertation or thesis? Think about who are the business stakeholders that would benefit from what you're finding, right? If it's zero, then it doesn't matter. But it's not going to be zero. There must be some, right? Because if we look at business stakeholders, we have internal stakeholders like investors, employees, executives, board of directors, audit committee, right? External stakeholders, we have regulators, community, creditors, external auditor, suppliers, and customers. So the good news for us is that no matter what we do in our research, there's somebody or multiple groups that should benefit from our work, right? That's the whole goal. So a couple of weeks ago, I was really happy because I received a message, not from a journal or anything, but it's from somebody from the FDIC. So FDIC is in Indonesia who's the one that insures the deposit in the banks? LPS? Right? So I received a call or a message from somebody in the US FDIC saying, hey, I came across your paper, you know, can you tell me more about it? And I want to understand what you found in it, right? So I was happy because, hey, you know, somebody actually read it outside of academia. Now, I'm not saying this happens all the time. That's why I was happy, because it never happens, very rarely. But at least you have to be proactive and selling to the editor and the reviewer. Look, my work really would matter to these stakeholders, but we cannot assume that the editor knows this. You have to proactively sell it. Okay, so let's walk through the main parts of the research paper and discuss the best practice to improve our chances of journal acceptance. Okay, so what I'm going to do right from this is I'm going to go through every single piece of the research paper that you all will do. And I'm going to talk about, okay, what I think is the best practice, what I think you should focus on, okay, and even some things to avoid. So that makes sense? So I'm going to get very specific. So let's start with the cover letter. We all know what the cover letter is. Cover letter is a letter that we write that accompanies our submission. And as you know, theoretically, the editor will read this before they read our paper and assign our paper to the reviewer. So for the cover letter, what I want to say is some journals do not require a cover letter. So when you go to the system, you can submit your paper without uploading a cover letter. But I recommend always having a cover letter. Always having a cover letter. Because a cover letter gives us another chance to communicate to the editor the importance and contribution of our study. Right? That makes sense? Be brief. It's no more than one page. Single space in Word. Right? So it's not going to take you a long time. It's one page. Have it look professional. So oftentimes I put the logo of my university on the cover letter. Right? Okay. So, you know, does this make sense? Right? So this is now what do you do in the cover letter, right? Okay, so let's go through it sentence by sentence or paragraph by paragraph. In the opening paragraph, I always say something like this: Dear editor of Journal X, we're pleased to submit our manuscript, right? You can read this. The manuscript has not been published previously, blah, blah, blah. And the final sentence is also very important. We have also enclosed the required journal submission fee. So you say that we paid, right? We always want to say we paid the submission fee, right? So this is the template, okay, this is my opening. And then paragraph 2, we want to state or discuss what is motivating our research. Okay, so before we get into what we do, what we find, no, you start with, okay, what is it that's pushing me to do this research in the first place? There must be something. Besides, you have to graduate. That's not right. Besides needing to graduate. For example, is there a business problem that is affecting business stakeholders right now that needs to be addressed? That is costing a lot of, money to investors or different stakeholders. Is there regulatory development affecting the business, right? That needs to be investigated. That has some unforeseen consequences. Is it resolving a certain debate in the literature or in practice? If you see that in the literature there's conflicting evidence or conflicting, right? Some of you had that issue on Monday, right? Where you had prior research presents conflicting evidence, right? That could be a good motivation for. Addressing a gap in the literature that needs filling. Right, so I'm just giving you some examples. I'm not saying this is all you have to write. These are just, but there's got to be an opening where, okay, let me tell you a story about what drove me to do this research in the first place. And why you should care, right? The editor. So also in this paragraph, after you do that, then you describe your research studies objectives. And then you want to describe how you conducted your research. Now, when you describe how you conduct your research in this one-page letter, you have to be brief, right? It's one page. No need for too much detail. Tout or advertise or make a big deal about any interesting or new data collected, right? Because that could be one of your competitive advantage. Okay. Mention how you measure the main variable. So what I'm saying here is that the editor has to at least have a preview of how you did what you found. Makes sense? So we're still in this paragraph 2. So and then finally describe and report your main findings. Right? What did you find? What did you find? Paragraph 3. Here you want to describe, and I say in parentheses, sell your study's contribution to the academic literature, to business practice, to business stakeholders, right? So after you do that in this paragraph, you want to let the editor know, hey, this is what I feel or I believe how my study contributes. And why should the journal in particular publish your work, right? So we just went through why this matters, right? Why you should care, what I'm doing, how I did it, how I contribute. Okay. And the closing statement, like the closing paragraph, describe how your study advances the journal's specific mission and objective. And this can be overlooked because if you look at the journal, you go to their website on Elsevier or their website, they usually have a mission or objective for that journal, right? Read it, and see if you can write about how your study can advance that journal's specific mission. Because as an editor, I know this because as an editor myself, I want to feel like my journal is important, right? Is that right? So tell me how your work can help my journal advance. And then finally, the last sentence, thank the editor and say you look forward to receiving his or her decisions. Right, so what I want to give you just a template of kind of this cover letter. Okay. Now, okay, next. So you've done a cover letter. What's the title of your paper? How do you determine the title of your paper? So let's say we have X and Y. X is construct A. This is the construct of the independent variable. Y is the construct for dependent variable. So tell me if you guys see this. You guys see when you come across journal articles, it's usually X and Y. X and Y. Does X affect Y? The influence of X and Y on Y. X and Y, insights from studying blah, 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 right? An examination of X and Y, how does X affect Y, evidence from, right? You see some variation of this, okay? Which is okay, I'm not saying this is wrong, this is what we typically see, which is okay, right? So recent examples from the accounting review, for example, unemployment risk and debt contract design. Unemployment risk is the X, debt contracting is the Y, right? Do high quality auditors improve non-GAAP, right? Do X affect Y, and the effects of transparency and group incentives on managers' strategic promotion behavior, right? The effect of X on Y. Okay, so that's one way you could do it. That's one way you could do it. But you could try for more interesting or unique titles, right? If you do this, it could be more remembered by readers, right? So some examples from the accounting review, which I thought were unique and interesting. For example, it has this. Is it better to kill two birds with one stone? Internal control audit quality and audit costs for integrated versus non-integrated audit. So the X is internal control quality and Y is the audit costs. But they start with this phrase, which, you know, is, as we know in the US is a popular phrase, right? Is it better to kill two birds with one stone? Right? It has nothing to do with the X and Y, right? When you talk, I remain silent. Spillover effects of peers' mandatory disclosure on firm voluntary disclosure, right? When you talk, I remain silent. That's pretty cool, right? Pretty catchy. So now there's no right or wrong approach. I've done it both ways. I've done it where I try to be unique and interesting, and the editor say, I don't like it, change it, right? I've had it where I try to be unique, and people at a conference, oh, that's a cool title. Again, we're not submitting to a machine, right? People have different biases. But just don't be too long. That's the number one thing, right? It should not be too long. Be succinct but complete, right? So take a look at your title. If it's too long, it takes too long to read. Try not to do that. And the title should capture the essence of your study. Okay. So that's about title, right? Okay, now abstract, right? We've done the title, now writing the abstract. We all know what the abstract is. It's a small thing, right? It's a very small thing. It's only one paragraph, usually 150 words. But what I want to say about abstract is do not underestimate the importance of the abstract. Guess what? The editor and the reviewers specifically, that's the first thing they read, is the abstract. I promise you. The first thing they read, especially the reviewer, not the editor. The editor may read the cover. The reviewer, that's the first thing they read is the abstract. So why not try to impress them, have them in a good place from the start? Right. Some journals specify the word limit for the abstract, then please adhere to that. I've done comments where my abstract was too long and they made me resubmit it. So when readers only read the abstract, they should know what your study is about and can cite it. Right? So this is something for the long run, for the long term. You want your papers to be cited, right? Very rarely, like we do this too, right? When you go to Google Scholar and you read a paper, you don't read the entire paper, right? Be honest, you don't. You read the abstract, right? That's okay. So the abstract should be in a way that you know what it's about, and you want to cite it. You want to cite that paper because that paper tells me, okay, what I need to know about the paper. And after reading the abstract, the reader should want to read more about the paper. That's the idea, right? If you read the abstract, you get a preview and you get excited about reading the remainder of the paper. Okay, now, how do you construct the abstract? Let's go line by line. Okay, this is what I do, or I think. The structure of the abstract. So, the opening statement or the opening sentence, this is ideally where you grab the reader's attention from the very start. So an example would be a statement about an ongoing business problem, like we said, mentioned, or new regulations with unknown. So this ties to your motivation. But the very first sentence of an abstract should grab the reader's attention right from the start. Right from the start. And then the next sentence or sentences should be state the objective of the study. And then state the hypothesis you are testing, but be careful to not just copy and paste your actual hypothesis from the paper. This is the number one thing that annoys editor and reviewer is repetition. So simply restate your hypothesis in a different way. Right? So that's the first three things. Grab the reader's attention, explain, okay, what's the big deal here? State what you're doing, state your hypothesis, describe the main results that you find and what those results suggest, right? Be brief, right, in doing this. And then state the literature streams you're contributing and which business stakeholders you're informing, right? So I've used this template for abstracts, and it usually works out. Okay, so you know, feel free to, you know, or adapt some of this to what you think, right? And by the way, one thing, I'm not saying what I'm presenting is the right thing, right? I'm just offering you my own kind of opinion, right? Okay, so we've done title, cover letter, abstract, introduction. Now let's spend some time on the introduction because I believe, and will continue to believe, that this section is the most important sections of the paper. Okay, it's the most important section of the paper. You can either, in this introduction section, you can either hook the reviewers to like the paper or lose the reviewers' interest in the paper. I can't tell you how many times I ask my friends in the academic circle who review paper, and most of it, some of them, a lot of them say that they only read the introduction. They only read it. So imagine this, you write your whole paper, right? You spend a lot of time making tables, describing your results, making it pretty, right? They don't read it. Because the introduction, they make up their mind, right? You know, so, but knowing this, let's invest time and effort into the introduction. Okay? And I'm going to show you how to kind of structure it. Right? But so do not underestimate the importance of this introduction section because you can either live or die here. Okay. Ideally, it's only 5 to 7 pages in length. Again, I've gotten comments from editors saying that my introduction was too long. Why was it too long? Because I had so much to want to say. There's so much I want to tell, right? I want to be detailed and specific, but at the end, I had to cut. Right? So ideally, it's 5 to 7 pages. So because it's 5 to 7 pages, you want to use the limited space wisely. Okay. So paragraph 1 to 2, right? What do we start with? What we start with is motivation. Motivation for the study. That's what you want to start with, right? So are you studying something important? Why should academics and business practitioners care about the topic you're researching? Okay, so you have to tell a convincing introductory paragraph about, okay, look, there's something going on in this world that deserves our attention and deserves study, whatever it is. Okay, whatever it is. So another important point is do not assume that the editor and reviewer knows the importance of your study. So this is a trap. We say, obviously they know this is a big deal. Obviously they know this is important, right? But do not have that mindset. What we have to do is you need to be a good salesman, saleswoman. You need to sell the review team that your research is a big deal. So have you come across a really good salesman, saleswoman, maybe at the mall? You know, they want to tell you everything about their product, you know, all the benefits, they don't tell the best, right? They sell. But that's what you have to do. You have to be proactive. hold the reader's hand and tell them exactly why this is a big deal. Okay? Whatever the topic, it could be ESG, it could be sustainability issues, it could be tax avoidance, whatever it is, it could be, whatever business topic is, the first thing you have to write is what is it that was driving you to research this topic in the first place? Tell the story. Tell the story. Right? So here you want to discuss why your research is important. So here's some examples, right? So these are some examples of motivation. Right? So some of this may not apply to you, but some of this may. Is there a costly business problem that you're tackling, right? Is there a new regulatory development driving your research, right? Is there a business practice that is broken, a concerning business trend that needs to be studied? Right? These seems, if you read this, this is, oh yeah, this is a big deal, right? This deserves to be studied. Right? It's your job to tell us, right? Does your research impact many different business stakeholders? Are you motivated by an unresolved debate in the literature? Is there a call for research by other scholars on the issue? Usually this number 3 is the most easy one, because usually if you read a paper, they say, oh, future research should blah, blah, blah. Then you can say, well, this guy or this group told me to study this, right? So that's a good start, at least. But not all topics have that. Are you motivated by ongoing debates and discussions by business practitioners and regulators? Does this make sense? So this is your opening paragraph, and it can't be too long, it can just be maybe one paragraph. So really think about, okay, if I step back, why does this matter, right? Why is this important? Why does this paper have to exist? Okay, so warning, this is a warning for us. Do not just say that your research is the first one to tackle the issue and has never been done before. Being first is not necessarily sufficient. So I can tell you right now is today I'm going to do research. I'm going to be the first one to study the association between the CEO's favorite ice cream flavor and financial reporting quality. I can be the first one. Nobody's done it, right? So who cares, right? And even if it works, what's the theoretical under, But you see my point? My point, and I know this is a trap, I fall into this trap too, by the way, saying that, oh, nobody's looked at this. I'm the first, to my knowledge, to our knowledge, we are the first one to study blah, 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 excellent. You can say that. I'm not saying do not say that, but you have to give more. Okay? Do not just rely on nobody's done it, we're the first. Does that make sense? Okay, so paragraph 3. So we've written paragraph 1 and 2. Paragraph 3 is the research objective. So here, you want to clearly state what you're doing in the research study. What exactly are you investigating? What research question are you trying to answer? Readers should know early on about the study's objective. So I have gotten the comment or criticism that it took too long for the reviewer to know what I was doing. And they said that they only knew what I was doing on page 5, right? And they were right, because I did not explicitly state what is it that I'm researching, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish. So please have that very early on in this paragraph, in the first page or second page. Okay. Okay, paragraph 4 to 5. Now, you want to explain or describe, okay, what's the theoretical mechanism or what's your logical reasoning? What do you expect to find and why? Concisely discuss your theoretical arguments and hypotheses. Explain the theoretical foundations of the research and the arguments that motivate the research hypothesis. Summarize and state the hypothesis. So in this paragraph, guys, is more about what's the theory you're using, and what's the connection between the theory you're using and your setting. What are your hypotheses? Now, you ask me, well, why do you have to do this? Can't they just read section 2? why do you have to do this? Why can't they just read the next section? They won't read the next section, right?
Oh.
Because I just told you, a lot of reviewers make up their mind in the introduction, so you have to give them a preview of what you're finding makes sense. That what you're finding has good, solid theoretical underpinnings, right? Does that make sense? So, yeah, so I know there's a section on hypothesis development, but what if they don't read it? They have to know that you have good theoretical foundation. So here, in section 2 of the paper, you already have a hypothesis development section, but here, do not simply copy and paste from that section to the introduction, right? So again, this is more like an art form that you can't just repeat that and just move it, right? You have to kind of restate things more concisely, more briefly, right? Okay. Paragraph 6 to 7. Paragraph 6 to 7. Now, once you've done all of that, now you can talk about your execution and your findings. In general, talk about how you execute your study. Talk about the data that you're using, how you obtain the data. Are there any unique data that you're using? If so, tout it, right? So again, you have to be brief here, right? But you have to tell them at least, okay, this is, you can read the details later on, but this is at least a preview, right? An introduction is basically like a preview, right? But if the preview is not good, they won't read the actual, see what I'm saying? Like you sometimes see, like when you go see a preview for a movie, don't you make a decision whether you want to watch it or not? Like I saw the preview for the Equalizer that you asked me to watch, right? I'm gonna watch that. It's a good preview. It's a preview, right? Everything we do, there's previews, right? The better it is, the better you're gonna follow through. How are you measuring your main variables of interest, right? So this is telling a story about the execution and findings. Again, if you have unique data or proprietary data or hand-collected data you spent a lot of time doing, you want to tout it, right? Make it a big deal, right? That you're not just using structured data downloaded, right? If you're using something specific, like a survey, instrument, or something, tell about, the really good respondents that you've got, right? Things about that, things like that. Okay, so also in this paragraph, summarize your main findings and results. You want to say that. Discuss your main findings. Discuss some of your additional analysis or robustness. Maybe not all. If you have a lot of additional analysis and a lot of robustness, don't waste the space telling every single thing you find. Just give the main and some of the important additional analysis. Based on the findings, what do you conclude? Right? So that's kind of what you want to get on paper. Okay, so paragraph 8 and 9, this is the last paragraphs of the introduction, the last paragraph of the introduction. And here it's all about contribution. So the first paragraph, motivation, is important. This paragraph is also very important, right? So here about contribution, you want to describe how your paper makes significant contribution on two fronts, academic contribution and also practical contribution. Okay. So usually we're good at which one? The top one, right? Because you know the papers that have been worked on, so you make a big deal about your filling a gap, etc. But I'm telling you, practical contribution also matters because now editors at the top journals, they have this fantasy almost that their journals will be read by non-academics, by like what my story, like the FDIC thing, it doesn't really happen. But editors have this fantasy that, oh, the papers in my journal are going to be read by everybody, right? So the more you can sell how your paper matters to non-academics, helps them fulfill their fantasy. Does that make sense? So it helps sell the paper. Okay, so in terms of academic contribution, this is how you do it. So first of all, you want to describe the literature streams that this study contributes to. You want to be very upfront and clear, right? Summarize what is currently known in prior research, right? You just want a summary, you don't have to go too long in it. It's not like a full lit review in this section. And then give details on how your study is different from prior work. Explain how your study adds to what we already know. Okay, so this is from an academic contribution standpoint. Okay, so so here it's important, like you want to assume that, let's say the reviewer doesn't know what prior literature has found, you want to give them you want to tell them what they found and how you are different, how you add to the common body of knowledge. And discuss what gaps in the literature are being addressed. Okay? So this is the thing that you can do, you've done. Practical contribution is you want to discuss how your study informs and helps different stakeholders. Okay, so here's the thing. It's not enough that you say in the paragraph, our research informs multiple stakeholders such as managers, dewan komisaris, auditors, analysts, and investors. Period. That's not what I'm saying. What will investors learn from your specifically? What will managers learn? What will analysts, auditors, right? Spend time in giving more details about how each stakeholder can benefit. Does that make sense? That's what I'm talking about. Not just a statement, oh, my study informs everybody, right? Okay. Discuss how the study can help change business practice and how firms can make better decisions. This is just an example, right? Just some examples. Discuss if there are any suggestions for public policy makers and regulators, right? Okay, so there's a lot you can, you have to think about this, right? You have to think about, okay, if somebody out there, outside this university walls, reads the paper, what will they learn? How will it change their behavior? And again, remember, when making your arguments about your study's contribution points, specific and detailed. That's my best advice. Okay? Be as specific and detailed. Like what I just said earlier about practical contribution, don't just say, just give specific reasons. It doesn't have to be too long, but you have to communicate it. Okay. So that's just the intro. You guys tired already? Feel like we've written the whole paper. Okay, let's keep going. Theory and hypothesis development. So this is section 2, right? So this is where you need to convince readers of your theoretical arguments and logical reasoning, right? We kind of know this. Some key thoughts. It's not enough that we have significant results. That's what I just mentioned earlier, right? So we over-rely that our results are super strong, that we don't have to tell a convincing story behind the results. That's a common fault. We need to assume that the reviewer is the most skeptical person. Do not assume that the reviewer will just take what you say and agree with it. In your mind, in the back of your mind, have this mindset, well, I need to really convince this reviewer. And work on having the most convincing and complete arguments as possible. Okay, so in this section, we also normally write like a background section. Right? You guys do that before you go into your hypothesis. So background section, there are different approaches, right? There's a literature review on the relevant topics, details about relevant regulations, key developments, and information from industry, interview results, even from key players. So the background section, if you need, you can talk about these different things, right? And a background section can be important, especially if your study is in a new area of research or on the intersection of multiple disciplinary research. If it's a new research area, you have to give a background because the reviewer may not be familiar with what has been done, correct? Okay, so this is just a little thing about background section. But when we're talking about theory development, first of all, obviously, we need to describe the theory or theories we're using. But guess what? This is the easy part. I'm confident we all can do this, right? Most of us can cite prior work and explain the theory we rely on. Like, for example, agency theory. We can all read Jensen and Meckling, Eisenhardt, those seminal papers, and we can write what agency theory is. We can write about what people have found, used agency theory, right? We can do that, which we need to do that. We need to do that. But it's not enough just to describe the theory. We need to explain how the theory is, number one, relevant to our particular setting, how the theory is applied to form our arguments, and how the theory supports logic. This is what we need to work on. This is the common thing that I see that most people don't do, is you have to make the connection between the theory and what you're doing in your setting, right? And how it supports your specific hypothesis. Okay, does that make sense? So specific as possible is also is necessary, right? What if you're not using a specific theory? And that can happen a lot, right? In accounting specifically. Like in management, they use theories all the time because there's like hundreds of theories. In psychology, they use hundreds of theories. In accounting, what? Agency theory is the most people use, right? So if you're not using a specific theory, we have to rely on findings and arguments of prior published works, right? Again, we need to collect and write about what prior researchers have argued for and found. Again, this is the easy part, right? You can go to Google Scholar and download all the relevant papers and then write a lit review and what those papers found and all that. That's the easy part. But what we need to do, what we need to focus on, because it's not enough to just write about the list of prior work, we need to explain specifically how prior studies build toward your arguments and support your hypothesis. This is the hard part. I know it's difficult. It's the difficult part, but we have to make the connection clear and convincing, right? And it requires a great deal of thought. So in sum, remember to make the connections clear, right? Okay. Next is, consider the sources that you're using. So you have a choice of what papers you cite, right? What papers you cite, what papers you download and talk about, right? So what are the good sources to use? Well, first of all, you want to balance relevancy and quantity. I know it's tempting to try to cite 100 papers, right? In every single journal, but some of them may not be relevant, right? So you have to think about relevance and quantity. Cite from the top tier journals, right? That's good practice, because usually those are the papers, obviously they've been cited or have been published. But we can also cite non-top tier, but we have to be selective. Right? We have to be selective. Because we want to send a message that to the reviewer that you're citing works, that come from the most vetted journals, right? Cite papers that have been heavily cited, right? So if you have a choice between a paper that's been cited 100 times and a paper that's been cited only once or twice, use the one that's heavily cited. Cite foundational papers and more recent papers. So here's the thing, do you cite the older papers or the newer ones? Well, the answer is you have a balance from both. Balance of both, right? The older ones set up the stage, those are foundational papers, right? But then you have newer ones, even working papers on SSRN, have a balance of both, right? Cite papers from the journal that you're targeting. So this is a big thing. Cite, so if you send me a paper as an editor for Journal X, and I see in your reference section, you don't cite anything from Journal X, then why are you submitting to Journal X? That makes sense? I learned this the hard way because I got desk rejected because the editor didn't see any references from his journal. Luckily, he allowed me to resubmit, right? Right? Again, editors want to feel their journal's important, right? If you're not citing anything from the journal you're submitting to, then why are you choosing that journal, right? And this is very easy to do, by the way. Very easy, right? Because especially, the general general knowledge journals, it's very easy to find 1 or 2 or 3 papers that are relevant. Non-academic sources can also be helpful. Somebody trying to get in? Non-academic sources can also be helpful. So for example, Big 4 firm, professional organization, reputable news media statements are regulated. Here's what I'm saying. There's a lot of materials that is informative that is not from academic papers, right? Like for example, Big 4, Deloitte, PwC, EY, I read all their, not all, I read a lot of their studies, surveys, thought pieces, and I like to cite them because they're from the Big 4, you know. Professional organizations like you know, domestically, like, I don't know, like EIE, if they have various materials that they release, so those are informative. Anecdotal evidence can also help if you have interviews or qualitative evidence. Okay. So let's talk about hypothesis. Let's talk hypothesis. How many hypotheses should you have? So nowadays, need more than just one hypothesis, right? We all agree. Presenting several hypotheses could be a strategic way to increase the paper's scope and rigor, right? So let's go through just very simple things like X leads to Y. X leads to X is a construct, Y is a construct. And let's say that, right, X is a construct of independent variable, Y is a construct of dependent variables. So let's say Y can be measured, or there's 3 different measurements. So each measure could be its own hypothesis, right? So to give you a real example, let's say Y is disclosure quality, right? And within disclosure quality, you can look at different things, right? You can look at earnings forecasts, financial statement disaggregation, you can look at the tone of financial disclosure. So this is something I actually did in one of my recent papers. Each measure, I talk about how I can hypothesize how it affects each of these things, right? If you look on the X side, the independent variable, same thing. You have a construct and you have 3 different measures. Each of it can be its own hypothesis. Right? So for example, if the X is CEO traits or CEO characteristics, so I may hypothesize something about CEO tenure, CEO education, and CEO compensation, for example, right? So there's a lot of different ways you can expand on your hypothesis. Some of you are doing this, right? Where you have a main effect and you can have hypothesis 2 and 3 being like moderating variables. You can have something like this. You guys are doing, some of you are doing this too, right? Where you have mediation paths. And you can look at H1 and 2, right? So this is stuff you already know, but this is one thing I wanted to mention. I said earlier that presenting several hypotheses can be a strategic way to increase the scope, but it's not ideal to just list a lot of hypotheses just to fill up space. I know it's tempting to say, oh, I want to write 10 different hypotheses or 12. Now, in management, they do that stuff, which is weird, right? And tiring to read. It's tempting to do that, right? But too many hypotheses can be confusing, right? And here's the most important thing. If you write a hypothesis, any hypothesis, remember that each hypothesis needs to be accompanied by complete and thoughtful discussion. I recently was an editor on a paper in AJPT, and it was almost ready to be accepted, but then it got into a problem because what they did, they presented a hypothesis 2, and they only had 2 sentences. 2 sentences developing or arguing for a case because they didn't think it was important. But then I said, well, if you have a hypothesis, you have to write and develop it fully, right? So imagine if you have 10 hypotheses, right? You got it's not right. So here's my thinking. Yes, you will have some small or minor predictions. They don't have to be hypotheses, they can be additional analysis. So some of the small or minor predictions can be written as additional analysis instead of formal. Be thoughtful and prioritize hypotheses that are most important. Okay. Okay. Almost done with the paper. So research design and result, I'm gonna go through this fast because I know that design and result is different depending on what you're doing. But here's what I wanna say. So think of, from a research design, think about giving someone a cooking recipe. Right? Where if you give them a cooking recipe, they can cook that on their own. Right? That's what we're trying to do in a research design, right? Describe the sample and the data source. That's what you want to do first. Again, advertise any use of unique or proprietary data. But here's what's important. Be as detailed as possible on how you measure the variables. Right? The more detailed, the better. The more detailed, the better. And think about constructing an appendix or separate table, especially for variable definition. So that's something I like to do sometimes, is have one table, a separate table where I list every single variable and then the definitions, right? You don't have to do that, but I kind of do. I like to do that sometimes. And here's another thing. In the regression model, of course, we need to list and write about all the control variables that are included, right? You guys do that well. But this is the easy part. You need to give a good explanation about why those control variables are included in the models. Does that make sense? So you talk about the main variables of interest, right? And what they are, but don't forget about the control variables, right? You have to fully explain, okay, why are these control variables important to include? So in this research design, you want to describe the design for the main analysis. Anything about additional analysis or robustness can be done later on in the results section, right? So in the research design, you're only talking about your design for the main analysis. Okay, so now let's go talk about your results. So now you have tables set up, you find good results. How are you going to discuss that in the paper? Well, there are two parts. There's discussion of the main tables, right? What you actually show in the tables. But there's also additional analysis and robustness tests, which can be, some of those can be untabulated, right? But the second one is important because nowadays editors are looking more than just your main analysis, right? And I'll talk about that second component later. But here, I'm not just talking about describing your tables, going a bit beyond. So I'll get to that. Okay, so for the main results, the discussion ties to the table shown in the paper, obviously. Here's the thing, if you can do this, this will be good. Well, describe the results clearly, that's this here. Make the readers understand the results without having to access the tables. So when you write the results section, just assume, let's assume the reader doesn't have the table, cannot see the tables. Can they still understand what you find in the tables? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a good approach, right? That's a good approach. And here, for the results section, we want to describe significance at two different levels, right? Statistical significance, I know we all do this already well, because this is just, you report the coefficient and the p-value, right? But this is something we don't do as well, economic significance, right? Nowadays, editors and reviewers are asking for both. So let me give you a brief example. So economic significance, let's say we have a model where we have CEO pay in rupiah on the left-hand side, dependent variable. We have gender and tenure. What is statistical significant? It's just the coefficient and the p-value, right? Or t-stat, right? But economic value, for gender, for example, the economic significance would be, okay, you have to say, well, female CEOs earn X rupiah more than male. You have to spell it out. Or you could say something about female CEOs earn X percentage higher than male CEOs. In other words, economic significance is, what does that coefficient say? What does it mean? Right? So it's not enough to say in this in table 2, we find that the coefficient for CEO gender is positive significant, suggesting that, you have to, if you can assign economic significance, what does that mean in rupiah? Right? Another just example for tenure, for example, right? You wanna say for every year worked, CEOs earn X amount in pay, or for one standard deviation increase in tenure, CEOs earn X amount in pay, right? So when you describe your results, tell a story about what that coefficient means in real term, does that make sense? Not just whether it's significant, positive, negative coefficient, right? Another way to economic significance, this is something I've tried in just recently. What you can do is you can compare the economic magnitude of gender and tenure, which is your main hypothesis, compared to control variables, right? So for example, we all know that firm size determines pay, right? So we can say, well, size has this X amount of influence relative to size, gender and tenure is what? You know, is it more significant, less significant, right? Just something about the magnitude. Okay, so now we've done the main analysis. Now, what about additional analysis? So this is something that we need to think about, right? So right now, it's not just enough to show analysis or results for your main hypothesis, which is obviously you have to do. But what are some additional analysis that you can include? So it goes beyond the hypothesis. A good way to increase the paper's scope. Think about any additional analysis that are relevant to the story, interesting to readers and reviewers, and spark future ideas. Right? So here I'm talking about what else can you show me? That's another way to put it. What else can you show me besides results for your main hypothesis? Okay. The more we can do with this, the more it helps us sell our paper. A robustness test, we have to show reviewers it shows reviewers your thoughtfulness. Also a good way to increase the paper scope. Think about robustness tests that corroborate main findings, alleviate concerns, right? So endogeneity, what are the things you do to help resolve endogeneity, where it's matching, right? With all these different techniques. It just gives reviewers more comfort about what you're finding. Okay. So usually we write the result section, everything based on the tables, but after that, we have two more sections: additional analysis, robustness. Again, the additional analysis and robustness, you don't have to show tables for everything because they get too long. Okay. Right. Okay. Conclusion section. Right. Conclusion section. We want to end the paper strong. Right. So some key thoughts. Again, if the reader does not read through the entire paper and skips to the conclusion section, they should know what you're doing and what you find. Okay, so in other words, the conclusion section should stand on its own. You have to think about, okay, what if the reader doesn't read everything and just goes to the conclusion? He or she should still know what we are doing, right? So the structure, paragraph 1, again, describe the objective of your study. Paragraph 2, describe the findings of your study and what readers should know. Paragraph 3, briefly state your study's contribution. So I know this is annoying because you feel like you're repeating a lot of things, right? And guess what? You have to say it differently because you can't copy and paste, right? So it's art form, right? To be able to describe, but you need to do this. Now, in these paragraphs, you don't have to be as long, right? You don't have to be as long. You can be more. Now, what's new though, is that what you've got to do in paragraph 4 is discuss the limitations. Discuss limitations of your research. Because none of our research is perfect, right? And it's good to show some humility to the editor, but we have to be careful. It's a fine line. Because if we're too humble, what happens? If we're too humble, then you're not, like they may say, well, you're not doing anything good, right? But, be balanced, right? Between humility and, still showing that you're doing good work. Discuss any limitations to your data and scope, right? You can do that. And also, limitation is a good way to handle reviewers' comments that you cannot address in the study. Right, so oftentimes I get reviewer comments. And interestingly, it works pretty effectively. Like they give me a suggestion that I know I cannot do. Because I don't have the data or I don't want to do it, because it takes too long. So I say, thank you for your comment suggestion, we gave it much thought. Please see our limitation section where we discuss, how this is good and this could be something that future research can do, right? So you can say that we can't do it, but we include it in the limitation section for future research to do. Does that make sense? That's a good way to do it. Finally, paragraph 5, discussion about future research. So this is what you want to end with, is you want to discuss your thoughts about, okay, now your study is published, what now what? What can people do after reading your study? What can they do next? So one good thing is you can turn limitations into suggestions for future research. That's what I discussed, that's what I mentioned, right? So you have a certain limitation, and you discuss the limitation, do not stop there. Acknowledge and say and give some ideas about what people can do in the future, not you, on how they can address your limitation. That's fair. Offer ideas on how others can extend your work. This is a good way to show the editor how your work can matter. Okay. So we went through intro, title until conclusion. The last thing I want to talk about, it'll take maybe 5 minutes, is writing quality. Right? So writing quality can be everything. Because if a paper is done perfectly, analysis is perfect, but it's written in a poor way, it can also get rejected. Right? So what I want to say here is that even English-speaking authors, meaning US or UK, right, struggle with writing quality. I know because I read what they send, right? So don't assume that just because we're not English-speaking, right? Even people that are English-speaking native have problems with writing quality. So what we do is in the first draft, do not worry about writing quality, just get the ideas on paper. So let's start from the scratch. So first draft, I don't worry as much. So in the first draft, I begin by building an outline of each section of the paper. And once the outline is ready, then you can fill in the details, right? That's just my personal way, right? Each paragraph that you write should have a clear idea and objective, right? And brief and succinct sentences are better. And also take advantage of technology, like Grammarly, I don't know what else is available, right? Now, here's the thing, writing style can be a problem when having multiple authors, because what happens is that author 1 writes the intro, author 2 writes the design, author, right? But when you put things together, you have to make sure it flows well. And again, be careful about too much repetition between sections of the paper. I just went through the intro until the end, and you can tell that there are certain topics that appear multiple times, right? Just be careful about not repeating or too much repetition. I've also gotten that criticism myself, where there was too much repetition from the intro to section 2 or the intro from conclusion, wherever. So just be careful about that. Here, using complex, fancy, and advanced word does not always mean higher quality. So I fall into this trap. Like I say, well, if I use big fancy word, it makes me look smarter, right? Words that are, that it's not common. But you have to look at the dictionary. Oh, if I use this word, it makes me look smart, right? But in my experience, the easier the paper is to read, the better. It's not that the reviewer doesn't know or doesn't understand, it's just the reviewer doesn't have that much time, right? If it's easy to read, it makes the reviewer happier. So, for example, let me give you this sentence example. So here, the CEO seemed to be equivocating when the board inquired about why she issued a plethora of ephemeral policies. Right, so let's say I wrote this sentence, right? Well, 3 of those words are big fancy words, right? They're not common, right? So why not say it like, the CO seemed to be unclear when the board inquired about why she issued many short-term policies. Saying the same thing, the bottom one is easier to read, right? So, you know, things like that, writing quality is a big deal, but if you think about it, you can address it with practice, with technology, with proofreading, right? Right. So, okay. I think, yeah, I do want to wish you success, right? Forward to what you guys do. I want to come back in 10, 15 years maybe and see you guys publishing all over the place, good journals, being successful, pursuing your research, advancing the research agenda of this country, right? Because there's not many researchers, accounting researchers in Indonesia. And you guys are at the leading edge because you're at the premier place, right? So I wish you much success. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Oh.
Yeah, I think, that's fine. Okay, thank you so much, Pak Adi, for the presentation. I think we still have some time if there are questions or comments that you would like to share. Maybe like 3 questions first, if you have any questions.
3 questions per person?
Like, so 3
I got
questions.
3, everybody 3 questions.
Okay. So we'll finish probably like at 9. Okay, questions, you can raise your hand if you have anything you want to ask. Maybe if you want to relate your experience writing your research paper in some of your courses, or like you're working on drafting your paper right now. Any questions?
Or you can share experience or thoughts. You know, in Indonesia is okay, Bahasa.
Yeah, in Bahasa that's okay because Pak Adi understands Bahasa, so don't worry. And I think everybody understands Bahasa. Or maybe what like a kind of questions like, so I have these papers and like this is how I try to explain the contribution, and you have any suggestions.
Sure.
So that's also okay. Yeah. Honey, you have.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay. It's not like you're trying to do something with your hand, right? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry for this, but I would like to ask about the repetition. This is really challenging for us. How sometimes we have to mention for several times. For example, about theory, when we talk, we would like to explain how we made this theory with our hypothesis, etc., our research actually. But sometimes several people require us to mention in the first part in introduction, and then in the hypothesis part, and then in our result and conclusion on discussion and conclusion. Sometimes it's really challenging for us to not doing some repetition. This is one of my questions. Could you have any strategy for to avoid this repetition first? And
Everybody is done.
I might remember, I might.
Okay, thank you. The second one is my remark about identifying the kind of our research. Sometimes our accounting topic would be related with management topic and behavior topic, psychological topic. And one of the speakers has ever said to me, I don't know whether it's true or not. If you would like to looking for your novelty, you could mix both more than one field. For example, you can blend between psychology and accounting, so you can get more novelty about that. But I found some of journals say this is not accounting research. This is maybe management research or psychology research and etc. And I found one of the researchers ever submit to accounting journal, and they just only say, sorry, we have to reject your paper because your theory is not accounting theory, but you use psychology higher theory for like that. And maybe some of supervisors say this is not accounting research. So may I know how we identify, maybe there is a keyword to make sure that our research is accounting research. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So for the first question about repetition, this is a good one because we all face this issue. So one good thing is, I would suggest is your French should be like, you know, the thesaurus. This is the beauty of the English language is that one word, if you look at the thesaurus, you can use like many different words to mean the same thing. So that's one easy thing, right? Like you don't have to use the same exact word every single time. So here's the thing, it's not like repetition is not allowed. You have to repeat the idea. It's just the sentence cannot be exactly the same, right? So I like to I use the thesaurus, and in words, it's just shift F7, right? Thesaurus, like the example I gave you there, like the last sentence, right? In English, what's good about English is that one word you can have 10 different versions for the same thing. So try to use different words, you know, from the source and kind of replace words that you can use, you know? So repetition is more about, and also here, like, for example, in section 2, that's when you want to give the most detail about your theory development and the connection between the theory you're studying and all that. In the introduction and that, you don't have to give as much detail. You're trying to summarize the key points of that, right? So it has to be more brief, more succinct than what you say, right? So if you look at hypothesis 2, right? What I do is I take it side by side. I look at what I write in the theory, and I see what I say in the intro, and I just compare and see how similar it is, and just try to make it as different as possible, right? So that's what I use. Like the easy thing is just when you use a thesaurus, you'd be surprised how many different words in the English language you can use to mean the same thing. Does that make sense? So that's like a kind of an easy tip, right? So I know it can be challenging. That's why I made a big deal about not having that repetition. Right? So your next question about is it accounting enough, right? So that's unfortunately not a simple solution because you have different editors. You have editors that are too narrow-minded, right? That says accounting has to be, etc. Right? There are some editors that actually value that you can do cross-disciplinary research. I'm one of those editors where I like it when you can cross accounting and something else in marketing or management. See what I'm saying? So that's something that unfortunately that's where I mentioned about subjectivity that comes in. You know, so there's nothing you can do, right? I mean, the only thing you can do is just to tout how having a topic that is crossed between two different is a strength, that it informs both sides of the literature, right? So it's kind of up to you to sell that as strong point. See what I'm saying? So, right, so like you're working on the cross between like perhaps accounting disclosure and sustainability ESG issues, right? So it's more talking about how your study in particular can inform, you know, scholars on both fronts, right? So that's in the introduction specifically, when I talk about academic contribution, that's where you want to talk about. So you can say, you know, your paper is one of the research that informs multiple streams of research, and you have to explain, you know, why and how. But to the best of your ability, use that as a point of strength. No, but I can't, but if an editor is narrow-minded and narrow, not narrow-minded, narrow in that accounting research has to be this, then it's difficult to change that. Right? Like there's some people that says accounting has to be, it's even worse, like some people say if it's not financial accounting, it's not really accounting. Or they say that taxation is not accounting, right? But then you know, it's very limited. The only thing you can do is just to do your best you can to sell that as a contribution point, that you are informing research, scholarly work in multiple areas, and this is how you're doing it, right? And how you're trying to do an intersection between those two. Right. I face that problem a lot because my research interest is on IT, the influence on IT on business, right? So some say if they read my paper, this is only accounting, it's IS, right? But then it's my job to say, well, these are ways that stakeholders that is relevant in accounting can learn from the research, right? So I'm sorry, I don't have a straight, easy answer. That's the thing. You just have to do your best to discuss it as a strong. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
But the repetition question, I think that's more easy to tackle. You just have to be more careful with your word choice and things like that.
Does it mean we should paraphrase this one
Yeah.
sentence, or maybe we just only mention not too specific in the one part and mention it.
Yeah, so
More
both.
specific.
So in the specific, it's in section 2.
Uh-huh.
In the intro, it's less specific. In inclusion, it's even more less specific. In the abstract is even less specific. So there's degrees. Section 2, you're talking about theory development, right? I'm just using theory development as an example, or theory arguments. That the detail should be in section 2. So you want to start with that section, write that section first, make sure it's detailed, and try to summarize that more succinctly in section 1. And again, use the thesaurus to see if you can use different word choices, right? And then in the conclusion is even less specific. So it's a combination of both, being less, more summarizing, less specific, and using different word choices. Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, other question? Yes,
Yes.
Prof. Ari.
Kalau boleh pakai bahasa
Yeah.
Indonesia, Pak. Jadi di paper yang kemarin ide yang saya sampaikan kemarin itu kebetulan ada concern dari pembimbing bahwa kalau trade off itu kan real earnings management itu ada tiga macam ya, dari operasional, kemudian yang paling populer itu SDT. Nah, concern dari pembimbing itu adalah kalau saya pakai istilah earnings management trade off itu kemudian saya cuma meneliti yang SGA-nya aja itu nggak cukup robust gitu untuk ujian sih, tapi concern-nya beliau itu. Nah, pertanyaan saya itu apakah ada concern kayak gitu juga nggak sih Prof di publikasi, karena misalnya yang saya baca sih sejauh ini yang meneliti soal real earnings management ke ESG itu baru yang SG&A ada, yang pakai production dan revenue base itu belum ada.
Okay, so trade-off real earnings management and accrual base,
Yeah.
right? So real earnings management, is there a reason why you also do not look at the other two?
Karena yang paper sebelumnya itu dia cuma pakai SG&A itu aja, reducing SG&A, affect the ESG.
Yeah, so if I were you and I do it, something to help, maybe it's just maybe it's not part of your main hypothesis, but as additional analysis to also investigate the other two components to see if there's anything there, even though it's not part of your hypothesis. That's why, like I mentioned about the additional analysis, that's where you can explore. And maybe this is a point of contribution where maybe you are, if prior papers do not do that, right? It's something that is worth exploring, right? To see if you can argue it different ways. So for example, if it should only impact SG&A and you don't right? Theoretically, then what you can do is you're using the production and the revenue, the other two, even more as like falsification tests. That it should not affect, right? So, but I would just look into it anyway, just try it anyway to see, okay, what does it look like when you have these three? Is it true that it only affects one component? Or is it, or will you actually discover something new that it would affect other parts of the earnings management? Previously not examined, right? But you always want to think about completeness and think about, because something like this is something that the reviewer will have anyway. And has anyway, so might as well try it and see what happens. So, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so, yeah, that's not, you can do that, I think. You can do that.
Okay, any other question? Yes, Consolata. It's been some time since I saw you, so it's great to see you today. One of our international students
okay.
at the master level.
Okay,
Question is on the writing the hypothesis summary in the introduction part. Maybe you're using variable like corporate governance. You're using like let's say 4 variables which are the corporate governance. Do I talk about each variable in the introduction part, or I will just use the summary of the corporate governance?
so what are you in the hypothesis develop? Are you hypothesizing each of the 4? So you have four different hypotheses for each variable of the governance. Okay, well, I mean, there are ways you can do it. Like if you don't want to go through each one again, but you can in the introduction you say, you hypothesize that corporate governance traits or corporate governance strengths will impact blah blah blah, and you can say in your study you have different measures to get at corporate governance environment of the company, right? And you can talk about it that way. So, but to answer your question in the introduction, you don't necessarily have to go to every single detail, right? It's more about, especially like you're just using 4 different proxies or measures of the overall corporate governance, right? But it's more important for you to explain in the introduction the underlying theory why corporate governance is expected to affect whatever. You know what I'm saying? That's the more crucial one, right? Yeah, so that should work. Could work.
My other question is how old reference, like when you say you're using all the references, there are some everybody says like we use 10 years.
Oh.
How old?
Yeah, so that's different depending on topics. So for example, like IFRS or XBRL, some of the new topics, old means 10 years ago. 10 years ago is already old. I'm talking about like there's things like agency theory, for example, goes to 1970 or 1960s, right? So that's more, but like there are newer topics where old means 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? When I say old, I'm saying first or initial research on that topic. I don't necessarily mean, it's not necessarily the year, but like when that topic came up, what are the early studies about that topic? The early studies on that topic could be 5 years ago, like big data topics, the ESG sustainability is more recent, right? So it's more about the early studies about that topic. So early studies about IFRS that you want to make sure you go to first. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we go first.
So I think I actually have 2 questions.
Okay.
First, consider our discussion yesterday.
Yes.
My dissertation is about integration sustainability. And yesterday I attended a workshop from PwC, and I was just thinking that my research may not have result that I expected. And Yuri also taught me that when I was in a proposal exam, like we can describe tension that maybe it's not like the result is not like what we expected. But then if it's if it's real, I mean, the result is not like unexpected, then how should I sell it? I mean, like, how should it, normally, like, if it's significant and then it's logical, so it's
Yeah.
sell easily, but if it's not. And then the second thing is about choosing the outlet for the publication. Maybe we decide from journal, or so should be like addressing like, okay, I'm gonna try, the first one is in a Q1 or Q2, or how we choose, like, based on my personal experience, and like, I don't think that my paper is good now, so I'm not really that ready to submit in the higher rank journal, but then I mean, it's still, there is an opportunity there to get feedback or something, so what do you suggest on that?
Okay, yeah, good question. So for the first one about so that one you can address where, so you're talking about like a two-sided prediction, right? So I would set it up where, actually, you could set it up where, the first thing, you want to have a balanced discussion of both forces, right? And just set the hypothesis as non-directional or null hypothesis, right? And just try to resell it to where it's actually more interesting that we may not know the answer. That's why you have to do the research, because it can go in multiple ways, in multiple directions. So turn it around and make it a strength, right? That's why empirical study is warranted, because the direction for the prediction is unclear. But then what's important is you have to present both sides, if there are both sides, kind of equal. Sometimes, even if we have a directional hypothesis that we have a prediction, sometimes we also add like a paragraph, a tension paragraph, saying why we may not find the predicted direction. But in your case, if it's even stronger than that, then you set it up as almost like a null hypothesis. And in the introduction, that could be part of the motivation, is that it's unclear what the effects would be, right? That's after you discuss why the topic is interesting to examine in the first place, right? You see my point? So it's not, for me, it's not an issue, it's not a detriment. You can just set it up like that. Does that make sense? So that's how you can help set up the hypothesis. So sorry, your second one was about
Outlet.
publishing outlet. Yeah, so thanks. The question, the answer is how much time do you have, right? Like you have to like, that's the thing, like I've worked with co-authors where they need to make tenure and they have to get a journal publication, so we cannot afford to waste time and go through, like I showed you the bookshelf, top shelf, second shelf, like something that's not realistic. What I would do though, just for a realistic standpoint, is let's say you identify a journal in Q1, whatever it is, try to find some papers that are kind of relevant, if any, in what your space, and just be honest and compare the quality of that paper to yours. Is there a big gap?
Yes.
Okay, is it a small gap, right? Well, then you just try to keep finding, go through the list, right? And but that's the thing, there's no, like what I do is that's what I do. I look at the papers, recent papers. I'm not talking about papers from 5 years ago. I'm talking about like this year, papers this year that have been published, and just see and be honest, okay, how do I compare in terms of novelty? How do I compare contribution? How do I compare in terms of scope? How do I compare against that? And that's how you can make a real determination, right? Because looking at the most recent publication gives you an idea of what they've been publishing. Does that make sense? So, and again, it just depends on how much time you have, because if you have a short amount of time, then you have to be more realistic, right? But if you have more time, then you can try maybe 1 or 2 journals above, and just see what happens. So that's the thing. That's why I don't love research a lot of times. There's so much uncertainty. And there's so many things you cannot control. And the review process is not perfect, right? So, but just practically speaking, that's what I would suggest. And also there are certain journals in even Q1 and Q2 that are topic specific, right? So like sustainability, issues. I know that there are, what's it called? There's a journal in Europe that is heavily accountability focused. But what I'm saying is that look through certain journals, and if there's journals that have published at least similar topics, then it could be a good bet to try. Because at least you're doing some area or topic that journal has liked for, right? Does that make sense? So it's just, you have to feel it out.
I think the most important thing is about time and periodicity because we publish for graduate also. So yeah, it's kind of
Yeah, for dissertation is different, but what I'm saying is once you graduate and you are full-time, then you can think about, okay, starting new research that maybe have, be more risk-seeking, even, be more, just be more brave in trying one or two. Sometimes it can be a good feeling to get rejected. Not a good feeling. That's a bad word. That's not a good feeling.
It's a lifelong
It's necessary. Right? It's an experience to get rejected because sometimes the goodness comes when you come across a rejection, but the review report is actually quite good, giving you a lot of good comments to help improve right. So that's what happened to me. Like a lot of my publications get rejected from the top, but they gave me really good comments that my second paper is even better than the initial submission that gets published, maybe not in the top tier. You see what I'm saying? But the rejection, as long as you learn from that rejection and you can have implementable suggestions and comments, that could be worthwhile. See what I'm saying? Maybe not for your dissertation, but maybe one day when you become, a lecturer and you have more time and you have more flexibility to try, right?
Thank you, Mido. So maybe last one because it's already like past 4 p.m. Yes, Farhan.
So when you see multiple country samples, from your perspective as reviewers, what sort of contribution that you would like to look at so that it's not too broad public or too common sense? So for example, if I go with China, it has a specific setting, but I think my challenge is when it comes to multiple countries, I kind of like, rather than saying that, okay, previous studies only discuss one country, while I would like to over more than one country. But from your perspective, what is the best way to put contribution in terms of multiple countries?
Yeah, for multiple countries, obviously you can talk about, you have to defend why that's valuable, right? So you have a group of countries, you have multiple groups of countries that have different similarities and differences. But the real contribution is you do find differences in the outcomes of the effects across different countries. If you find that, then that to me is a contribution, right? So that's one good defense of why looking to different countries could make sense. So for example, you look at different countries, but then when you cluster them to different groupings, you find different effects, right? When you look at certain country environments and other country environments, right? So, but this is what I want to say. Just the fact that you're using multiple countries by itself may not be a contribution. You have to kind of defend what we can learn more by using this multiple countries set, right? And to me would be like, if you have countries that you have, for example, you have less developed countries, developing countries, and then, right? You're interested in seeing how these effects can manifest differently across the group. Because each of these groups of countries have different rules, regulations, right? Have different investor protection strengths and stuff like that. So almost kind of use that as an additional layer of examining this effect across multiple settings.
So is it actually better to just be focused on a specific setting rather than?
Yeah, no, that's the thing. That's my point. So if you have, if it doesn't necessarily require that, then here's the thing. Like using multiple countries by itself is not an advantage unless, to me, you're testing how whatever effect you're testing should behave differently across different country groups. Does that kind of make sense? So for example, this happens a lot in the IFRS adoption studies, right? Where they look at US versus Europe, because there are clear differences in how IFRS would manifest, right? So they look at that. But if you're looking at a topic and you're just saying, okay, I use all these countries, you know, you can do that, but it's not necessarily a contribution by itself. Right, but
So better not name it that contribution.
again, I don't know, it depends on if you find cross-country differences. Right? But see, that's the thing, like, in the papers that I've been reading and the papers I do, it's just a given that we just use US companies, right? Because it's one country. And that's the unfairness of this world, right? Because all the editors and reviewers are US people, right? So, like, we use one country all the time, which is the US companies, right? But explore, like, if you do find, if you want to use a cross-country setting, and you find interesting differences across those, then you possibly can tell them. Right? Or I think in your case, it's because you're using cross-country because you don't have enough data, right? For one country, right? Okay. And that makes sense. So then you just do that. I mean, you can defend that as a motivation where in the design section that you take advantage of data across different countries to get a more generalizability of this effect in Asian countries, right? Example. So you can how does that if you don't necessarily want to try to argue that it should behave differently across. You cannot use Indonesia because you don't have enough, right? So it's a power issue, right? But don't say that. Just say that you're taking advantage of data and insights across across countries, right? But it's all in the same region, right? Like you're not selecting one country in Asia and one country in Mexico, like Mexico, right? It's all in the region. So you're just saying instead of country, you're saying in the Southeastern Asian region to get a sense of how this effect manifests in this environment, group of countries. So that can be used as a strength. That's one, right? So you can provide more generalizability. But in the event that you do find, when you do slice it and you find different effects across countries, then you could maybe sell that too. Right? And then try to link it to how institutional differences in these countries predict these differences. Then that's adding a layer of contribution, right? Then try for a bigger journal. Right?
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. So I think we have enough questions for today. So if any of you still have questions, maybe so Ali will come back right next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe at that time they already have like a draft that you can look at and give some feedback.
How many will have graduated by next year? Everybody will be here?
Okay.
Okay, so I will see you next year.
They're just being humble. Prepare to like defend their reputation. So thank you so much, Pak Adi.
Yeah, thank you so much.
For the presentation
Okay.
and very insightful talk today. And thank you everybody who's coming. And basically hope this will give you like a fresh idea on how you will, kind of write up your research. So I will send you all the PowerPoints for your reference. Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you for I think we have something for
Okay.
hopefully you haven't.
Group
Yeah, we'll do after this. So I think this is the factory. We have I'll get the picture of the. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, how much did we take?
Presume. Oh, I see. Oh, headphones.
I just like, it was like one day. It's like. I don't want them to have like, oh, you know, oh. Like,
There's a lot.
Ada yang di sini juga kan? Ada yang di sini belum?
How about this side?
Iya, yang this side, this side.
Oh iya.
Oke, gaya.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh ya,
Iya. Ada rekamannya.
Send it to you.
Ada dari dulu.